sometimes you just gotta drink like a mule. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about a book, and one book in particular, and that is, of course, No Life Forsaken by Steven Erikson. The second book of Witness. It came out last week. I read it once so far. I really enjoyed it, and I've decided to do the thing that I've been doing for books in general recently. I know I have done different things with malazan books in the past, and when I next read No Life Forsaken, which will happen sooner or later, trust me, I will try to do like the read-along kind of thing where I go through it book by book, the way I have done with most other malazan books. It just didn't pan out this way this time around. So this is me giving you a general discussion of themes that stuck out in No Life Forsaken. I'm sure other people will make a lot of videos on lore questions. There are, of course, a lot of lore things that people can get really excited about with these books. I'm not one of them. Yes, I have, like, theories and stuff, but I don't think that's where, like, for me, most of the joy from reading malazan books comes from. Instead, it's more about, like, the thoughts, the theories, the ethical questions, the themes, that kind of stuff. So that's what we'll be doing today. And we'll do this the usual way. I'll give you a quick sort of like introduction what this is without any spoilers, and then you go and read the book, which, you should at this point. And that will, of course, at least have some spoilers for The God Is Not Willing, because, this is the second book in the follow-up trilogy to a 10-book series, so, then we'll switch into a more like detailed discussion of spoilers. Well, not necessarily that many more spoilers, but at least some stuff, because we're going to talk about themes and all of those things. So yeah, that's what we'll be doing. So let's get started, right? All right, No Life Forsaken. As I said, second book in the Witness series, which is built around, well, Karsa Olong, or the effects that Karsa Olong has had on the malazan world and the aftermath of being, well, Karsa Olong, I guess. And as makes sense in this regard, this one is set in Seven Cities, which is, of course, where Karsa Olong ended up after he had to leave Genebakis, which, was where the first one, that being The God Is Not Willing, was set. So we are now following sort of like the aftermath of Karsa's second large sort of step in his life's journey, and that is, well, interesting. It is, well, 7 cities, so 7 cities things happen, which means a lot of cults are fighting it out, and there is another rebellion brewing, because that's kind of what happens in 7 cities every couple of years. We kind of already knew that from reading the malazan Book of the Fallen, so no surprise that this is happening yet again. So what we see here is, have as a story is, well, malazan officials in Gdanisban around High Fist Arenfall, trying to keep everything calm, keep 7 cities at least away from like another full-scale revolution or rebellion, with imperial politics between an adjunct and so forth. And at the same time, we have the reawakening of the cult of Varshaik, which is, of course, Felicin Younger's a cult that we last saw in The Bone Hunters and kind of left hanging in the air there. So the question is, like, what became out of that specific story? And what happens if the goddess Varshaik is actually becoming more active, and the apocalyptic is coming back yet again? So basically what we have is those two storylines converging, as you might say, in Gdanisban for a big showdown, as always, and lots of fun bits and pieces all around that. Yeah, I mean, what can I say? If you have read The God Is Not Willing, you will definitely read this. If you're interested in malazan stuff, you will definitely read this. One thing I'll say is I enjoyed this one more than The God Is Not Willing. I did enjoy The God Is Not Willing. This one had more of an old school malazan feel, and whether that is because of, being in 7 cities, which I kind of like more as a setting, or whether that is something intrinsic to the way this story was written compared to the first one in the Book of Witness, I don't fully know. I'll also say This one requires a bit more, or refers to a lot more background knowledge from the Malazan Book of the Fallen than did The God Is Not Willing. So there are things in here that will either be hard to understand or spoil parts of the Malazan Book of the Fallen in the way that The God Is Not Willing did not necessarily do. So keep that in mind if you have only read The God Is Not Willing and are wondering what to do now. Alright, that's the non-spoiler part. Let's get started and talk about details. All right, and so what we're going to do is look at a couple of things here. As so often with these Malazan books, there's way too much to talk about. I don't have the camera capacity to do all of this. I'm sure I'll be coming back to bits and pieces of this again and again in the future, so no worries. And one thing that I wanted to look at first, because I don't think I've ever done that, is Erikson's specific style or voice, because it's something that I think can be helpful for us to understand or, think about what makes a specific writer so unique. I recently did that when talking about the way that Thomas Pynchon does set up scenes and dialogue and stuff in Shadow Ticket as something that can help us understand, the writings of Thomas Pynchon. And it seems to me that there is something that Steven Erikson does that is, similar and different, but is once again a very specific literary technique that is not necessarily as widespread in traditional fantasy, so it might be worth pointing that one out as a specific key in Erikson's writing and voice here, and I think that helps, hopefully. And that is inner monologue, because, a lot of characters, a lot of writers obviously give us inner monologues in one way or another, or some other perspective on the thoughts of our characters. And Erikson does that as well. What is interesting to me, and what I think can be challenging to some readers not necessarily used to Erikson's writing style in particular, is the way this is done by in the Malazan books. And that is, these inner monologues, these thoughts, these inner perspectives are written in a very, very clear sort of like dialogue speech form, right? Sometimes people don't write out full inner monologues as basically a speech, or sometimes more as an actual monologue, almost like a speech in that regard. And Erikson doesn't necessarily do that. What Erikson usually does is inner dialogues, more or less, between different aspects of a personality, and they're all written in what you might call vernacular, like actual, like the way we would talk out loud, and interacting and arguing, characters arguing with themselves in those words. And that can be interesting because that is obviously interwoven with characters also actually talking to other people in an outside scene. So you have, once again, this sort of like melting down or crossing or blurring of the border between the inner world of a character, our perspective, in this case our point of view character, our focus character in part of a scene, and the larger scene, the things that are actually happening outside. And that once again feels very postmodern, and in some ways does come close. That's why I said, like, in some ways similar to what Thomas Pynchon does, right? Because we have characters that are talking to each other, and then we're switching to like the thoughts of one of those characters, and they are written in the same language, in the same voice as their vocal speech, basically, and then so it can take a moment to realize that no, they're not actually speaking out loud what I'm just reading right now. This is basically switching between thought language and vocal language in a lot of ways, and I think that as a technique adds a very specific atmosphere to the Malazan Book of the Fallen, because it in some ways is more realistic, I would argue, to how we as humans often work, because we as humans tend to narrate our own story, and sometimes when we think through things, I mean, some of us even talk aloud sometimes when we're alone. We talk with ourselves to verbalize and give voice to our thoughts, and sometimes that can be very helpful. So having these thoughts also follow that specific rule, I think, is, well, it's not unique to Steven Erikson, but it's certainly particular and a characteristic of the Malazan Book of the Fallen's writing that, for example, when you compare it to Cam Esselman's writing, who has a very different voice, and you don't have that specific approach to it there, this very a very dialogue-oriented thought world, and I wanted to bring that one up as an introduction, sort of to my thoughts here, because it stood out very, very starkly to me while reading this one in particular, and thinking back about it, that has always been there. It's just, probably the first time I'm talking about it, and I figured I'll just do that. Moving on, let's talk about some of the other sort of overarching themes that always come back, because at this point, it's not like Steven Erikson is introducing radically new ideas into his world. It's more like finding new ways of talking about themes that have always been there. And one thing that particularly stood out in connection to The God is Not Willing is the threat of flood. Now, obviously, that has an in-world logic. That is, of course, the dying away of Antosvelak and so forth. And that means, and the building of the inland sea in Raraku. So there is a lot of water going around. So it makes sense that flood is once again a big threat here. Now, obviously, this is also something that we should all think about in our world out here, because, there is such a thing as climate change, and we talked about it when we talked about The God is Not Willing, and we're talking about it now, because, water is rising, and we as humans need to do something about it, and that's sort of what I want to focus on for now, is the way that people in the malazan world deal with the threat of a flood. Now, obviously, in The God is Not Willing, what we had is, that glacier breaking and that massive, basically, flood that comes about over everything in, very short moments, so you need to evacuate and run as fast as possible. What we have in here is a slow flood, where specifically the underquarter is going to be flooded, and people need to make way for people that have slowly to vacate their places, find new places to live, and so forth. What is necessary in both situations, however, is a governing structure, in this case the Malazan Empire, that has to step in and organize these kind of things. And in both stories, what we see is, at some point, some people within the Malazan organization stepping up and taking over the role of guiding, organizing refugees, doing all of these things. But we also see how bureaucracy, rivalries, and frankly, people not taking those threats very seriously can hamper the efforts to mitigate these effects of flood. And if you look at the world right now, you may find parallels between those two, these things there as well, because we kind of know that shit's going to go bad with climate change, but it's not like our governments are doing a hell of a lot at the moment about it, and the people that are actively trying to do something have to overcome a lot of really weird structural problems. Now, I'll just leave it at that, but I think it's interesting to see this as a sort of topic cropping up again and again in the Malazan Book of the Fallen in general, but also in particular in these last two books. There is a certain urgency to that, and I wanted to bring that up. A final other thought there is that for me was that in the moment when I saw, it's a flood again, I was, okay. And I thought a bit more about it, and I think what is interesting to me is how floods make for very narratively interesting natural disasters, in the way that, say, an earthquake doesn't necessarily, or a firestorm doesn't necessarily. Obviously, we hear about fire in this one as well, but what with, the whole, Leoman thing. But once you've written something like the Igatan chapter, there's not much more you can do with fire, whereas floods you can do a lot with, because every flood is very different in a narratively interesting way. Just look at these two last flood catastrophes that we have, with the underquarter slowly, water seeping in, people building dams and so forth. On the one hand, and on the other hand, a massive, basically a tsunami, completely flooding everything within seconds. Those are very different stories, but they still feature the same natural disaster, the same natural threat in one way or another. And I think maybe in that regard, when it comes to elemental forces, I feel water might just make for better storytelling in general. I don't know. Just a thought that I wanted to bring up. But let's move on to another thing that I found interesting here, and that is mirroring characters. And obviously that's something that Erikson has done before. That's something that we've seen in literature in general. what is interesting to me here is that there are two sort of like mirrors in some ways. But they both center on Inquisitor Bornu Blood in one way or another, right? And I wanted to look at that. The first pair is, of course, Pash and Bornu in one way or another. Both serve a high priestess or goddess in one way or another. And both are physically seen as unattractive or are either noticed for their troubling looks in the way of Bornu, and are ignored because of their complete non-descriptiveness in the case of Pash, and both experience rejection and discrimination and marginalization because of their looks. And that is obviously an interesting sort of setup, because they too, both of them do work with that reality in different ways, and I think that is interesting to see. Where on the one hand, Bornu has turned into, well, very much a cynic, someone who does not actually, believe in the goddess, in Varshaik, someone who has basically given up all, like, hope for things like love, acknowledgement, and so forth, and focused his entire being on one skill that he is really, really good at, which is, research and becoming a scholar, basically. So he has sublimated that rejection and discrimination because of his physical appearance. He has sublimated all of that into excellence in one specific field. That is certainly something that we can see in the world in all kinds of situations, where people that are handicapped in one way or another often focus that feeling of insufficiency, that self-doubt and self-hatred that is often comes with that, whether it's a physical disability or anything else that leads to marginalization and discrimination. And yes, physical appearance in a world that is so heavily focused on, well, images these days, is certainly one way where people who feel inadequate will try to make up for that in a different way. And we can see that approach with Bornu. Now, obviously, we know where the story ends, and we'll get there in a moment. That is not all, because that is not a healthy way and not a healthy approach. The other version is, of course, the way that Pash goes with the High Priestess at the end of the day, where once she is shown some modicum of recognition and appreciation and just acknowledgement, basically, that leads to devotion and fanaticism in one way or another, and basically assuming that she is doing the right things because she is doing the unacknowledged will of her mistress, and the one person that has shown her some form of appreciation or acknowledgement, which is also very much the wrong way of going about this, because both of these are very unhealthy sort of like things. The problem is, of course, that if you suffer discrimination, marginalization, and so forth, it is very difficult to overcome that and not fall either into the trap of fanatical devotion to the one person that does at least recognize you and acknowledge your existence in one way or another. That can lead to incredibly toxic relationships, trust me. Or the attempt of like turning yourself into like the one person who does that one thing better than everyone else. That is, both of these are leave you unbalanced with bad consequences. And I just wanted to look at show how that sort of like is paralleled in the book, how those two characters mirror in that regard. But sticking with Bornu, there's a second layer here that I found really interesting, and that is when we look at his love for his assistant, whose name is currently escaping me because there's way too many names in this book, that he believes is unrequited. And we know that she also loves Bornu, the Inquisitor, despite because he's generally a good guy. But she also believes that he is not, willing to see that, or she's not worthy of him. So we have a pair of like potential lovers whose love is unrequited, for both of them, or seems to be impossible. And that very much mirrors the relationship between the adjunct and his bodyguard, right? Where they start out the whole thing in a relationship in one way or another, and clearly love each other in one way or another. We know that, that is the case, but because of external circumstances or perceived external circumstances, that relationship also breaks up. The adjunct sending his bodyguard away because, it seems unprofessional and so forth, and the bodyguard then starting to go in other directions, to all the hurt that comes from bad breakups basically showing up. And I think this is interesting because it does, once again, these two mirror each other in their resolution. One is where people assume external forces that make their relationship, their love, impossible, and the other assume internal circumstances. Bonu assuming that he's just too does not look well enough, good enough for that, and his assistant assuming that she's not worthy of him. And in both situations, we have a power dynamic, with one being clearly in power, and the other person being the bodyguard or assistant to their lover or potential lover. And how that power dynamic can also make any form of relationship difficult, if not impossible. And what is important to see here is that that is technically impossible unless there is a way to resolve that power dynamic, and it's impossible in the case of the adjunct. It doesn't work that way. Adjuncts just have to die, I guess. And we see how that turns out, by which I mean really poorly. Whereas in the other direction, that situation is resolved by, all the changes in the cult, the way that Bornu, by becoming Inquisitor and his former assistant becoming head librarian, the power dynamic is resolved, right? The external power dynamic has been resolved. They're now, parts of different aspects of the religion, so that external power dynamic has been resolved, which only leaves the internal things for them to overcome, which is the resolution for Bonu's story at the end, where Hasten, who may or may not be Quick Ben, sends Bonu's soul back with the goal of, uniting him with his lover and finding all of that balance, right? He does the things that he's really good at, but he's also found recognition beyond that, beyond his knowledge, just for the person that he is, that personhood. And I think that is just an interesting way of looking at the structure of the novel, how it builds these sort of mirrored pairs of story development, and through those makes claims about what it means to to live the good life, I guess, or at least find ways to deal with all the injustices that we all suffer all the time. Which is, of course, the next big part that we need to talk about: injustice and the apocalyptic. Because what we see here with Varshaik is, of course, a reframing of the apocalyptic beyond Drachna, beyond the things that we know from House of Chains and so forth, the whole storyline about the jilted lover and so forth, where the goddess is always seen as a personal one person ascending and building the rage around one personal slight and one personal wounding, and thus becoming sort of like the focus for all this other rage. And that is flipped around into, this time around, it is very much the idea that out of all the constant injustices that the unjust world delivers to everyone, out of those injustices, enough rage always boils up that if it's not, finds other more productive ways of being used to make the world a better place, to reduce the injustices, that rage will accumulate and will find ways to express itself in wanton destruction and violence. It's from injustice to rage to violent, catastrophic destruction, which is nihilistic at its core. And that is, at the end of the day, what happens to the religion of Varshaik and the apocalyptic, and the way that it is turned around, I think, is an interesting reframing. And I would argue there's something very fascinating happening here. See, there is a lot of fantasy that does indulge in wanton destruction and nihilism. And if you look into the world right now, there's a lot of people who also have indulged in wanton destructiveness, voting for political candidates that promise them violence and revenge and retribution, and not exactly, solutions that are in any way productive. And I think that is... well, that's a very astute sort of observation in a world where people don't see any way of, reaching justice, of finding a better, productive future. That rage, that frustration will be channeled into wanton destruction and nihilism. And we need to overcome that. But we need to be constructive. Once again, it mirrors the fear of the flood that everyone kind of has, but if nothing seems to be done, why not just burn down the entire thing? It's something that a lot of us have felt in the past, I would argue. But Erikson has often talked about that in the context of grimdark fantasy, which often indulges in this, everything's shit, nothing's ever going to get better, might as well just enjoy the wanton destruction and maybe even laugh about it with enough ironic distance. And that is obviously something that the Malazan Book of the Fallen has always argued against, with ideas of empathy and compassion, which we often use. But there is, a deeper core to that. And that means, these are active things. We need to actively strive to build a better world, to make sure that fewer and fewer people are forced to walk the path of rage to nihilism and violent destruction and an apocalypse, which will never actually lead to something positive afterwards, right? We need to find a way to go down that road. And so the way this story is resolved in one way or another, with, finding a new way to rebuild the Church of the Apocalyptic in a more productive way and all of that, that can be seen as one way of overcoming and arguing against grimdark fantasy in itself within the world of the Malazan universe. And that, I think, is a really interesting way of reading this book. And that finally, I think, comes to the final sort of larger element. This is, of course, another book about Kar Sorlong, or the effects of Kar Sorlong. And I think this is interesting because Kar Sorlong has always been sort of like a blessing and a curse for the Malazan Book of the Fallen in general, what with a lot of people really loving that character and a lot of people possibly loving him for all the wrong reasons. There's essays about it. I mean, I guess some of you have read The Problem of Kar Sorlong. I highly recommend you do that if you haven't. But what is interesting here is that Karsa's unapologetic violence is certainly something that a lot of people find attractive. It's the same thing that a lot of people find attractive in Conan the Barbarian. It's it's that Nietzschean Übermensch that doesn't care about anyone and just moves on. We find that very fascinating from the outside because it gives sort of expression to all our fears and hopes, where we feel that we can't actually change anything. So we admire people who seem to get away with just doing whatever they want, whenever they want, what kind of moral code might lie behind that doesn't really matter. We appreciate the pornography of force, in the words of Canadian punk band Propaganda, and that is dangerous. So what this entire series does by following Kar Sorlong's story that so many people have applauded and think is one of the best, strongest and so forth storylines and character lines in the entire Malazan Book of the Fallen, this time around we just see all the havoc, all the pain and all the hard work that everyone that follows such leaders, that has to walk behind the path of destruction, all the hard work of rebuilding, of finding ways to making this productive, to making this all work out, have to do. And we saw that with, Rant and everything in The God Is Not Willing. And this time around we're seeing it with Felice and Younger, who, yes, Kar Sorlong killed Bidithal, and that was certainly cathartic to a lot of readers, but knowing that your violator has been killed doesn't make you whole, does it, right? And that is, I think, the sort of last step here in the series in general. Violence can be necessary, but it should never be the final, the final step. It can never be all of the solution. It has to be something else. And that other thing is humans coming together and actively building a better world, not just being empathetic and compassionate, but also making sure with physical steps of making the world a better place, which is, for example, why the point where Mail talks about the idea that the flooding can be turned into a functioning sewer system is exactly that. You turn the violent flood into something new, something productive that people will benefit from afterwards. We need to go beyond just the violence. And that is something that fantasy often fails. That's something that politics often fails at. And certainly something that our imagination often fails at. And No Life Forsaken, I would argue, is a book that shows us that we need to actually do that. Anyway, these are my thoughts for now. There will be more, I'm sure. If you have thoughts on it, let me know down below. I don't know, like, subscribe, comment, join the Patreon if you want to, give me money if you want to. You don't have to. Most importantly, read good books, and even more importantly, be good people. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, thanks and cheers.